The unexpected signal. Ethan sat alone in the cockpit of his small mining ship, staring out at the endless void of space. The faint hum of the ship's engines was the only sound keeping him company. Days on this remote mining colony were all the same, boring and repetitive. It wasn't the life Ethan dreamed of, but it paid the bills. Suddenly, his console beeped. A sharp, insistent noise broke the silence. Ethan frowned and glanced at the screen. It wasn't the usual mining alert or maintenance warning. It was a signal, weak, garbled, and coming from deep space. Ethan tapped a few keys, adjusting the receiver. Static filled the cabin. And then, through the noise, a voice emerged. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. Help. Ethan. Coordinates attached. Hurry. The message was brief, cutting out before he could hear more. Ethan froze. The voice belonged to Sam, his best friend who had gone missing years ago during a dangerous mission. Everyone thought Sam was dead, but now, here was a message, clear and unmistakable. Ethan replayed the signal, his hands trembling. The coordinates included in the message pointed to a sector notorious for its dangers, a lawless region controlled by alien slavers. Few who ventured there ever returned. His mind raced. Was it a trap? Could it really be Sam? Memories of their time together flooded back. Sam had saved his life once during a near-fatal accident. Ethan owed him everything. He couldn't ignore this. But the risks were enormous. Abandoning his post could cost Ethan his job, and venturing into a slaver-controlled sector could cost him his life. He stared at the flickering coordinates on his screen, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. Finally, he stood up, his jaw set. "If it's really you, Sam," he muttered, "I'm coming." Ethan hurried to the ship's engineering bay. His ship wasn't designed for combat, but he wasn't about to head into dangerous territory unprepared. He spent hours modifying the vessel, reinforcing its shields, and installing a cloaking device scavenged from old equipment. Sweat dripped from his brow, but he didn't stop until he was sure the ship could handle whatever awaited him. As he worked, doubts crept in. What if the signal was fake? What if it was a slaver's trick to lure unsuspecting victims? He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. Sam's voice had been real. He was sure of it. When the ship was ready, Ethan sat back in the pilot's seat. His fingers hovered over the controls. The mining colony's lights twinkled faintly in the distance, a reminder of the quiet, predictable life he was leaving behind. "Goodbye, peace and quiet," Ethan said with a small grin. He punched in the coordinates, and the ship's engines roared to life. The stars outside blurred as he jumped into hyperspace, heading straight for the unknown. As the ship hurtled toward its destination, Ethan reviewed what little he knew about the sector. It was home to the Zarnok slavers, a ruthless alien faction notorious for capturing and exploiting thousands of beings. Their prison planets were rumored to be impenetrable fortresses. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision. If he failed, no one would come looking for him. He was on his own. But if there was even a chance Sam was alive, Ethan knew he had to try. Hours passed, and the ship dropped out of hyperspace. Ethan gripped the controls tightly as the view ahead came into focus. A massive planet loomed in the distance, its surface covered with sprawling industrial complexes and glowing energy fields. It was heavily guarded, with patrol ships circling like vultures. Ethan activated the cloaking device and carefully navigated closer. His ship's scanners detected numerous life forms on the surface, but he couldn't pinpoint Sam. Frustration bubbled within him. He needed more information, but getting closer increased the risk of detection. Then the console beeped again. Another signal, weaker this time, but unmistakably Sam's voice. "Ethan, don't trust anyone. Save us, before it's too late." The signal cut off abruptly. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Sam wasn't just in trouble. He was warning Ethan about something bigger. But what? And who else needed saving? Ethan's resolve hardened. Whatever was happening on that planet, he would find out. And he would save Sam. no matter the cost. The prison planet. Ethan's ship hovered silently in the shadow of a massive asteroid, its cloaking device humming faintly. Below him loomed the prison planet, an industrial monstrosity surrounded by swirling clouds of ash and toxic gases. The planet's surface glowed with sprawling complexes and factories, their harsh lights cutting through the choking darkness. Orbiting the planet were slaver patrol ships, their sleek designs bristling with weapons. Ethan's fingers danced over the controls, activating his scanners. Thousands of life forms registered below, scattered across the surface in tightly packed clusters. The readings confirmed his worst fears. This was not just a prison. It was a factory of suffering. Suddenly, the ship's console lit up with red warnings. A patrol ship had veered dangerously close, its sensors sweeping the area. Ethan's heart pounded as he quickly adjusted his trajectory, drifting deeper into the asteroid field. The cloaking device held, and the patrol ship passed without incident. Close call, Ethan muttered to himself, exhaling sharply. He turned his attention back to the scanners. Somewhere down there, Sam was alive. Barely. The signal Ethan intercepted earlier had been faint, like a whisper in a storm. It wasn't just a distress call. It was a cry for help buried under layers of encrypted frequencies. Sam had clearly found a way to send it out under the slavers' noses. But for how long? Ethan pulled up a holographic map of the planet's surface, highlighting the coordinates embedded in Sam's signal. The location was deep within one of the planet's largest complexes, a sprawling facility surrounded by energy fences and armed guards. "This is going to be impossible," Ethan said, shaking his head. But even as he said it, he knew he had no choice. Sam had saved his life once. Now it was Ethan's turn to repay the debt. He activated his ship's stealth drones, sending them down to the planet to gather more intel. The drones transmitted live footage as they descended through the toxic atmosphere. What they revealed made Ethan's stomach turn. Rows of alien prisoners, chained and broken, were being marched into massive factories. Overseers, towering slavers with glowing red eyes, barked orders and lashed out at anyone who faltered. The prisoners weren't just working. They were dying. The air was thick with pollutants, and the factory machines emitted searing heat. Ethan clenched his fists. It wasn't just about saving Sam anymore. This place was a nightmare, and it had to be stopped. One of the drones zoomed in on a specific group of prisoners. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There, limping at the back of the line, was Sam. His once strong frame was now gaunt and frail, his face streaked with grime. But his eyes still burned with determination. "Hang in there, Sam," Ethan whispered. The drone continued its surveillance, revealing something unexpected. Among the prisoners, there was a quiet but deliberate exchange of glances, gestures, and smuggled tools. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he realized what he was seeing. These weren't just prisoners. They were rebels. Suddenly, the drone feed cut off. Alarms blared across the prison complex, and guards rushed to the location. Ethan cursed under his breath. The slavers had detected the drone. He quickly recalled the rest of them, but the damage was done. They would be on high alert now. Ethan knew he needed a plan, and fast. He couldn't storm the planet with just his ship. The only way to get to Sam was from the inside. With a heavy heart, he made his decision. He activated his ship's autopilot and set it to hide in the asteroid field. Then he grabbed a bag of tools and supplies, adjusted his disguise to look like a prisoner, and prepared to eject from the ship in a small escape pod. As the pod descended through the planet's atmosphere, Ethan's mind raced. He had no weapons, no backup, and no guarantee of survival. But he had something more powerful: a purpose. The pod hit the ground with a jarring thud. Ethan stepped out, coughing as the toxic air stung his lungs. In the distance, he could see the massive factory gates and the rows of prisoners being herded inside. He adjusted his disguise, blending into the crowd of new arrivals. His heart pounded as he approached the gates, where towering slaver guards scanned each prisoner with cold efficiency. When it was Ethan's turn, a guard loomed over him, its glowing red eyes narrowing. Ethan held his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. The guard scanned him with a device, grunted, and motioned him forward. Ethan exhaled in relief and stepped into the complex. The air inside was thick with the smell of oil and burnt metal. Everywhere he looked, prisoners toiled under inhumane conditions. But amid the despair, Ethan saw flickers of resistance, hidden tools, whispered plans, and stolen glances. He knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was a fight for freedom, a desperate plan. Ethan leaned against the damp, metallic wall of a storage bay, deep inside the sprawling prison complex, his mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of what he had seen so far. The air reeked of burnt machinery and sweat, but Ethan had grown numb to the stench. His body ached from the grueling labor forced upon him during the day, but his mind couldn't rest. Time was slipping away. Sam was alive, but barely. Ethan had caught glimpses of him across the factory floor, his movements slow and deliberate as he tried to avoid the overseer's wrath. Worse, Ethan had learned that the prison wasn't just a labor camp. It was a machine of destruction. The weapons being forged here were destined for an impending galactic war. If they weren't stopped, countless worlds would burn. Ethan rubbed his temples, the weight of his mission pressing down on him. He couldn't just save Sam and leave the others behind. There were thousands of prisoners here, each one as desperate as Sam. They needed a miracle, and Ethan had no idea how to deliver one. Suddenly, a faint voice broke his thoughts. "You're the new guy, right?" Ethan turned to see a slender alien with silvery skin and piercing green eyes standing in the shadows. The alien, who had introduced himself earlier as Kale, was one of the few prisoners who seemed to have a spark of hope left in him. Ethan had noticed how Kale subtly coordinated small acts of rebellion, passing tools, spreading messages, and organizing prisoners into quiet factions. "Yeah," Ethan replied cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" Kale stepped closer, his movements quick but measured. "I've seen the way you work. You're not like the rest of us. You've got a purpose. And if that purpose is what I think it is, we need to talk." Ethan tensed. "What do you think my purpose is?" Kale smirked. "You're not here by accident. You're looking for someone. But let me guess. You've realized this isn't just about that person anymore. You want to take these slavers down." Ethan's jaw tightened. "And what if I do?" Kale leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Then you're going to need help. This place is a fortress. You can't take it down alone." Ethan hesitated. He hadn't planned on involving anyone else in his mission, but Kale's words struck a chord. The alien was right. There was no way he could dismantle the prison's defenses and rescue Sam without allies. "What do you have in mind?" Ethan asked. Kale's green eyes glimmered with determination. "The slavers think they have total control, but they don't. We've been working in the shadows for years, gathering intel, sabotaging where we can. What we need is a trigger, a spark to ignite a full-scale uprising." Ethan folded his arms. "And you think I'm that spark?" Kale nodded. "You've got skills we don't. You're an outsider, and that makes you unpredictable. We've got the numbers and the will to fight, but we need someone to tip the scales." Ethan considered Kale's words. The idea of leading a rebellion was daunting, but it also gave him a chance to strike at the heart of the slavers' operations. If they could destroy this facility, they wouldn't just save the prisoners. They'd cripple the slavers' war machine. "All right," Ethan said finally. "What's the plan?" Kale pulled out a crude map etched onto a piece of scrap metal. "The prison's main power grid is located here, under the central factory. If we take it out, we'll disable the energy fences and the automated defense systems. That'll give us a fighting chance." Ethan studied the map, his mind already working through the logistics. "What about the guards? They'll swarm us the moment the power goes down." Kale smiled grimly. "That's where the rebellion comes in. We'll stage a distraction. Draw the guards away while you take out the power grid." Ethan nodded, though the plan was far from perfect. "And what happens after the power goes down? How do we get off this rock?" Cale hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. "We're still working on that part." Ethan sighed. It was a gamble, but it was the best shot they had. "Fine. When do we start?" Cale grinned. "Tonight. The overseers are planning a mass transfer of prisoners tomorrow morning. If we don't act now, we'll lose half our numbers to the slavers' war effort." Ethan clenched his fists. There was no time to waste. "I'll need tools, explosives, if you have them." Cale nodded. "Already taken care of. Meet me in the maintenance tunnels in 2 hours." As Cale disappeared into the shadows, Ethan leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. He had come here to save Sam, but now he was fighting for something much bigger. The odds were stacked against them, but Ethan knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't leave this planet until the slavers were destroyed. 2 hours later, Ethan stood in the dimly lit maintenance tunnels, his heart pounding as Cale and a small group of rebels handed him the tools he needed. The rebellion was ready, and the countdown had begun. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Inside the enemy's lair, Ethan crouched low in the shadows of the dimly lit maintenance tunnel, his heart pounding like a drum. The rebellion's plan was simple on paper: disable the prison's power grid, spark chaos, and launch a full-scale uprising. But standing here, surrounded by the cold, metallic walls of the prison complex, the reality felt far more daunting. Cale motioned for Ethan to follow. The slender alien moved like a shadow, his steps silent despite the jagged terrain of pipes and machinery that lined the tunnel floor. Behind them, a small group of rebels followed, each carrying stolen tools and weapons scavenged from years of labor in the prison's depths. They were tired, battered, and outnumbered, but their eyes burned with the fire of determination. "This way," Cale whispered, gesturing toward a rusted hatch. "It leads to the central power station. The guards rarely patrol here, but keep your eyes open." Ethan nodded, gripping the makeshift tool belt he had assembled. Every step forward felt like a gamble, each one pulling him deeper into enemy territory. The hatch creaked as Cale pried it open, the sound echoing faintly down the tunnel. Ethan winced, holding his breath as they waited for any sign of alarm. When none came, they slipped through one by one. The power station was a sprawling chamber, its walls lined with pulsating energy conduits and glowing control panels. The air thrummed with the sound of machinery, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through Ethan's bones. At the center of the room stood the main power core, a massive cylindrical structure that glowed with an eerie blue light. Cale pointed to the core. "That's our target. We overload it, and the entire complex goes dark. But we've got a problem." Ethan followed Cale's gaze to the far end of the chamber, where 2 slaver guards stood, their hulking forms silhouetted against the glow of the power core. The guards were heavily armed, their glowing red eyes scanning the room with cold efficiency. "I'll handle them," Cale said, his voice steady. "You focus on the core." Before Ethan could protest, Cale slipped away, his movements eerily fluid. Ethan watched as the alien disappeared into the shadows, his heart sinking with the weight of what they were attempting. This wasn't just a mission, it was a suicide run. With Cale creating a diversion, Ethan approached the core, keeping low to avoid detection. He reached the base of the structure and began unpacking his tools. His hands moved quickly, his engineering training kicking in as he bypassed the core's security systems. Sparks flew as he pried open a panel, exposing a tangle of wires and circuits. Behind him, the sound of a scuffle broke out. Ethan glanced over his shoulder to see Cale engaged in a fierce fight with the guards. The slaver brutes were slow but strong, their massive fists slamming into the floor as Cale dodged and weaved with an agility that seemed almost unnatural. Despite Cale's skill, it was clear he couldn't hold them off forever. "Hurry up, Ethan," Cale shouted, his voice strained. Ethan gritted his teeth and focused on the task at hand. He connected a series of wires to the improvised overload device he had built, his fingers working with precision despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The power core began to pulse erratically, its glow intensifying with each passing second. Suddenly, a warning siren blared, its deafening wail echoing through the chamber. The guards must have triggered an alarm. Ethan's stomach sank as the sound reverberated through the prison complex, signaling to every slaver on the planet that something was wrong. Cale took advantage of the distraction, delivering a swift blow to one of the guards and sending it crashing to the ground. But the second guard was already charging toward Ethan, its heavy footsteps shaking the floor. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He wasn't a fighter, but he couldn't let the mission fail. Grabbing a loose metal pipe, he swung it with all his strength, catching the guard across its midsection. The impact barely fazed the brute, but it gave Cale enough time to leap onto its back, driving a stolen blade into the base of its neck. The guard let out a guttural roar before collapsing, its red eyes dimming as its massive body hit the floor. Cale staggered to his feet, breathing heavily, and gave Ethan a nod. "Nice work. Now finish it." Ethan returned to the power core, his hands shaking as he completed the final connections. The overload device beeped, signaling that the system was primed. "It's ready," Ethan shouted. "Then let's move," Cale yelled, pulling Ethan away from the core. They sprinted toward the exit as the power core began to emit a high-pitched whine. The glow intensified, casting eerie shadows across the room. Just as they reached the hatch, the core exploded in a blinding flash of light, sending shockwaves rippling through the complex. The lights flickered and died, plunging the prison into darkness. Alarms blared in every direction, and chaos erupted as prisoners across the complex realized what had happened. Shouts and cries echoed through the halls as the rebellion began in earnest. Ethan and Cale emerged into the fray, their hearts pounding as they joined the swelling tide of prisoners rising against their captors. The slavers, disoriented by the sudden blackout, struggled to regain control. But for the first time, the prisoners had the upper hand. Ethan glanced at Cale, a determined glint in his eyes. "This is just the beginning," he said. Cale nodded, a fierce smile spreading across his face. "Then let's make it count." The first spark. The prison complex was in chaos. The blackout had plunged the entire facility into darkness, save for the sporadic flashes of emergency lights flickering in the hallways. Alarms wailed, and the shouts of prisoners and slaver guards echoed through the corridors like a storm brewing in a metal jungle. Ethan ducked into a shadowed alcove, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Beside him, Cale crouched, clutching a stolen plasma blade, its faint blue glow illuminating his determined expression. "We've bought ourselves a chance," Cale said, his voice low but steady. "But this isn't over yet. If the slavers regroup, we're done for." Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind racing. The power grid was down, the energy fences were disabled, and chaos reigned, but their rebellion was still fragile. The prisoners were disorganized, scattered across the sprawling complex. Without coordination, this moment of opportunity would collapse like a house of cards. "We need to rally the prisoners," Ethan said, his voice firm. "They need to know this isn't just random chaos. It's their chance to fight back." Cale nodded, his green eyes glinting in the dim light. "Agreed. But first, we need to neutralize the overseers. If those brutes regain control, they'll crush the uprising before it starts." Ethan peered down the corridor, his gaze landing on a central guard station. It was heavily fortified, its metal walls bristling with automated turrets and surveillance equipment. Inside, the slavers' commanding officer, a towering Zarnak with 4 arms and a vicious temper, was barking orders at a group of guards, trying to restore order. "That's our target," Ethan said, pointing to the station. "If we can take it out, the prisoners will have a fighting chance." Cale grinned. "I like the way you think, human. A bold assault." The plan was reckless, But there was no time for second-guessing. Ethan and Cale moved quickly, gathering a small group of rebels as they advanced toward the guard station. Each member carried whatever weapons or tools they could scavenge. Makeshift spears, plasma cutters, even pieces of broken machinery. As they approached, Ethan paused, his mind racing as he studied the station. The turrets were offline, thanks to the power outage, but the guards inside were still heavily armed. A direct assault would be suicide. "We need a diversion," Ethan muttered. His gaze fell on a stack of fuel canisters near the station's entrance. A plan began to form. Cale followed his line of sight and smirked. "You really don't like subtle, do you?" Ethan grinned despite himself. "Not when time's running out." The group split up, with Ethan and Cale sneaking around the back of the station, while the others positioned themselves near the canisters. Ethan rigged a small detonator using components from his tool belt, his hands moving with practiced precision. "On my mark," Ethan whispered into his comm device. 3, 2, 1, now. The explosion was deafening, a fiery blast that sent shockwaves through the complex. Guards spilled out of the station, their weapons drawn, as smoke and flames engulfed the area. The rebels sprang into action, striking with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Ethan and Cale slipped into the chaos, using the smoke as cover. Inside the station, the slaver commander barked orders, its booming voice cutting through the din. Ethan clenched his jaw. If they could take out the commander, the guards would lose their leader and their morale. Cale moved like a blur, his plasma blade slicing through the air as he took down the guards one by one. Ethan, less skilled in combat, focused on disabling the station's communication systems. Sparks flew as he ripped out cables and smashed control panels, cutting off the slaver's ability to call for reinforcements. The commander roared in frustration, its red eyes blazing as it turned toward Ethan. "You dared defy me, human." It snarled, raising a massive energy mace. Ethan froze, his mind screaming for a way out. But before the commander could strike, Cale appeared, his blade cutting a deadly arc through the air. The Zarnak staggered, its 4 arms flailing as it tried to fend off the relentless assault. "Finish it," Cale shouted, his voice strained. Ethan grabbed a heavy piece of debris and swung it with all his strength, striking the commander squarely in the head. The Zarnak let out a guttural cry before collapsing to the floor, its body lifeless. Rallying the prisoners. With the station secured and the commander defeated, Ethan and Cale turned their attention to the next phase of the plan, rallying the prisoners. Using the station's loudspeakers, Ethan broadcast a message that echoed through the complex. "This is your chance." Ethan's voice rang out, firm and resolute. "The slavers are weakened. Their defenses are down. Stand together, fight back, and take your freedom." The response was immediate. Across the prison, the scattered groups of prisoners began to coalesce, their despair transforming into determination. Armed with whatever they could find, they surged toward the central factory, their numbers growing with each passing moment. Ethan and Cale led the charge, their hearts pounding as they fought side by side with the rebels. The slavers, disoriented and overwhelmed, struggled to hold their ground, but the tide had turned. The prisoners were no longer victims. They were warriors. A flicker of hope. By the time the dust settled, the central factory was in ruins, its once imposing structures reduced to smoldering wreckage. The prisoners stood victorious, their chains broken and their spirits unshackled. Ethan leaned against a piece of debris, his body battered but his resolve unbroken. Cale approached, a rare smile on his face. "You did it, Ethan. You sparked the fire." Ethan shook his head. "We all did. This was just the beginning." Cale's smile faded, his gaze shifting to the horizon, where slaver reinforcements would inevitably arrive. "Then we'd better be ready for what comes next." Ethan nodded, his jaw set. The first spark had been lit, but the battle was far from over. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they wouldn't stop until every chain was broken. The gamble. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burning metal. The once unshakable prison complex was now a battlefield. Fires raged across the central factory, sending plumes of black smoke into the toxic sky. The uprising was in full swing, but the fight was far from over. Ethan crouched behind a fallen metal beam, his chest heaving as he reloaded a plasma pistol scavenged from a fallen guard. Beside him, Cale pressed his back against the beam, gripping his plasma blade tightly. Both their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, their breaths shallow. "We're holding them off for now," Cale said, peeking over the cover to assess the situation. "But reinforcements are coming. A lot of them." Ethan nodded grimly. The slavers had regrouped faster than expected, and the rebellion's initial momentum was starting to falter. The prisoners, brave and desperate, were fighting with everything they had, but the slavers' superior weaponry and organization were beginning to turn the tide. "We need to act now," Ethan said, his voice firm. "If we don't cut off their reinforcements, this whole uprising will collapse." Cale turned to him, his green eyes narrowing. "What are you thinking?" Ethan gestured toward the towering command tower at the heart of the complex. It loomed above the battlefield like a sentinel, its spire piercing the darkened sky. Inside, the slavers' command center was coordinating their response, directing reinforcements and deploying their reserves. "We take out that tower," Ethan said, "and we sever their chain of command. Without it, they'll be in chaos." Cal's expression was a mix of admiration and doubt. "You're insane. That place is a fortress." Ethan managed a grim smile. "Maybe. But it's our only shot." A high-stakes infiltration. Ethan and Cale moved swiftly, weaving through the chaos of the battlefield. They gathered a small team of rebels, those brave enough or desperate enough to join the suicidal mission. Each carried whatever weapons they could find: scavenged plasma rifles, makeshift blades, and grenades crafted from repurposed mining equipment. The team approached the tower under the cover of smoke and debris. The lower levels were heavily guarded, with slaver patrols stationed at every entrance. Automated turrets scanned the perimeter, their barrels glowing ominously. Ethan turned to the group, his voice low but commanding. "We split up. Cale, take half the team and create a distraction. Draw their attention to the west side. The rest of you are with me. We'll infiltrate from the east." Cale smirked. "You've got a knack for making impossible plans sound doable." "Just keep them busy," Ethan replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll do the rest." Cale and his team disappeared into the shadows, while Ethan led his group toward the eastern entrance. The air was tense with anticipation as they moved silently, avoiding the gaze of the patrolling guards. When the first explosion erupted from the west side, the guards scrambled, leaving their posts to respond to the threat. "That's our cue," Ethan whispered. They slipped inside, navigating the sterile metallic corridors of the tower. The walls were lined with glowing panels, displaying tactical data and surveillance feeds. Ethan's heart pounded as he led the group deeper, every step bringing them closer to the command center and closer to danger. The final push. As they approached the upper levels, resistance stiffened. Slaver guards, alerted by the commotion, converged on their position. The narrow corridors became kill zones, with plasma fire lighting up the darkness. "Cover me," Ethan shouted, ducking behind a console as a barrage of plasma bolts scorched the air above him. The rebels returned fire, their shots wild but effective. Ethan used the momentary reprieve to hack into a control panel, overriding the tower's automated defenses. Sparks flew as the turrets deactivated, clearing their path forward. Cal's voice crackled through Ethan's comm device. "We're pinned down on the west side. Can't hold out much longer." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Hang in there. We're almost there." Pushing forward, the group reached the command center's main doors, thick, reinforced slabs of metal designed to withstand anything short of an orbital strike. Ethan set to work, attaching a makeshift explosive charge to the locking mechanism. "Stand back," he warned. The explosion was deafening, the doors buckling under the force. Ethan and the rebels surged inside, weapons raised. The slavers' command center was a hive of activity, with Zarnak officers barking orders and scrambling to respond to the rebellion. The rebels opened fire, catching the slavers off guard. Ethan's eyes locked onto the central control console, a massive terminal surrounded by glowing holoscreens. If he could destroy it, the slavers would lose their ability to coordinate reinforcements. "Cover me," he shouted, making a break for the console. The battle raged around him as he reached the terminal. He began rigging it with explosives, his hands moving quickly despite the chaos. Plasma bolts zipped past him, and the air was filled with the sounds of shouting and screaming. "Hurry, Ethan." Cal's voice rang out, cutting through the noise. Ethan finished setting the charges and activated the timer. "It's done. Fall back." The rebels retreated, fighting their way back through the corridors as the timer ticked down. The slavers, realizing what was happening, pursued them relentlessly. Ethan's lungs burned as he sprinted, his mind focused solely on escaping the blast radius. The gamble pays off. They burst out of the tower just as the explosives detonated. The ground shook violently, and a column of fire erupted from the command center, sending debris raining down. The tower collapsed in on itself, its spire crumbling like a house of cards. The battlefield fell silent for a moment, the rebels and slavers alike stunned by the sight. Then, a deafening cheer rose from the prisoners. The slavers' command structure was broken, their forces thrown into disarray. The tide had turned. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Cal approached, a broad grin on his face despite the cuts and bruises marring his silver skin. "You actually did it," Cal said, offering Ethan a hand. Ethan took it, pulling himself to his feet. "We did it, but it's not over yet." Cal nodded, his expression sobering. "The slavers still have reinforcements off-world. They'll come for us." Ethan's eyes hardened. "Then we'll be ready." The gamble had paid off, but the fight was far from over. The rebellion had won a crucial victory, but the cost had been high. As Ethan looked out over the battlefield, he knew one thing for certain. They had lit a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. Freedom and sacrifice. The wreckage of the command tower still smoldered in the distance, casting a faint orange glow against the darkened horizon. The battlefield was eerily quiet now, save for the crackling of flames and the distant hum of machinery slowly grinding to a halt. The prisoners stood in clusters, their faces a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Ethan leaned heavily against a broken piece of machinery, his body battered and bruised. Every muscle ached, but the sight of the fallen tower filled him with a grim sense of accomplishment. Cal approached, his silver skin marred with soot and blood, but his green eyes still burned with determination. "We did it," Cal said, his voice low but steady. "The slavers are in chaos. Their forces are scattered." Ethan nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. "This is just the beginning. They'll send reinforcements, probably an entire fleet. We've bought ourselves time, but not much." Cal gestured toward the crowd of prisoners gathering around them. "They're looking to you now, Ethan. You sparked this rebellion. They need a leader." Ethan's stomach tightened. He wasn't a leader. He was an engineer, a man who had stumbled into this fight because he couldn't abandon his friend. But now, with thousands of lives depending on him, he couldn't walk away. "Let's focus on getting everyone off this planet first," Ethan said, deflecting the weight of Cal's words. "Have we located any ships we can use?" Cal nodded. "There's a hangar near the northern perimeter. The slavers keep their transport vessels there. If we can seize them, we might have a chance to evacuate." The final stand. Ethan and Cal led a group of rebels toward the northern hangar, moving cautiously through the maze of debris and ruined buildings. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. The slavers, though disorganized, were still dangerous. Patrols roamed the perimeter, their glowing red eyes scanning for signs of rebellion. When they reached the hangar, Ethan's heart sank. The massive structure was heavily fortified, with automated turrets and a contingent of slaver guards standing watch. Inside, several transport ships were docked, their engines idling. "This isn't going to be easy," Cale muttered, surveying the defenses. "It never is," Ethan replied. He turned to the group of rebels. "We're not going to get another shot at this. If we take this hangar, we have a way off this rock. If we fail, we lose everything." The rebels nodded, their expressions resolute. They knew the stakes. Ethan devised a plan on the spot. Half the group would create a diversion, drawing the guards away from the hangar. The rest would infiltrate through a maintenance entrance, disable the turrets, and secure the ships. The diversion team launched their attack first, setting off a series of explosions that lit up the night sky. The slavers scrambled to respond, leaving the hangar partially unguarded. Ethan and his team slipped through the maintenance entrance, moving quickly and silently. Inside, the hangar was a massive, echoing cavern of metal and machinery. Ethan located the turret controls near the back of the structure and set to work disabling them. Sparks flew as he pried open the control panel, his hands moving with practiced precision. "Hurry, Ethan," Cale urged, keeping watch. "I'm working as fast as I can," Ethan replied, his voice tense. The turrets powered down with a soft hum, and Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Turrets are offline. Let's move." The rebels surged forward, engaging the remaining guards in a fierce firefight. Plasma bolts lit up the hangar as the rebels fought with desperate ferocity. Ethan and Cale pushed toward one of the transport ships, clearing a path through the chaos. The sacrifice. Just as victory seemed within reach, a deafening roar filled the hangar. A massive slaver warship descended from the sky, its shadow engulfing the battlefield. The rebels froze, their triumph turning to dread as the ship's weapons powered up. Ethan's heart sank. The slavers had called for reinforcements, and now they were here. The warship's cannons began to charge, their glow intensifying. "We can't fight that thing," Cale said, his voice filled with despair. Ethan's mind raced. There was only one way to give the prisoners a chance to escape. He turned to Cale, his jaw set. "Get everyone on the ships. I'll handle the warship." Cale's eyes widened. "You're not serious. That's suicide." Ethan gripped Cale's shoulder. "I'm serious. Someone has to buy you time, and I'm the only one who can do it." Before Cale could protest, Ethan sprinted toward a small fighter craft docked near the edge of the hangar. It wasn't much, but it was armed, and it would have to do. As the transport ships began to lift off, carrying the prisoners to safety, Ethan launched the fighter, its engines roaring to life. The warship turned its attention to him, its cannons locking on. "Come on," Ethan muttered, gripping the controls tightly. "Come after me." The fighter dodged and weaved as the warship opened fire, its massive cannons unleashing a barrage of plasma. Ethan pushed the fighter to its limits, drawing the warship away from the fleeing transports. He knew what he had to do. The fighter's weapons wouldn't be enough to destroy the warship, but its overloaded reactor might. Ethan set a collision course for the warship's main cannon, his hand steady despite the fear coursing through him. As the fighter hurtled toward its target, he thought of Sam, Cale, and the thousands of lives he had fought to save. "This is for all of you," he whispered. The fighter slammed into the warship in a blinding explosion, the shockwave rocking the fleeing transports. The warship erupted into flames, its massive form breaking apart and crashing to the ground. A legacy of freedom. On board one of the transport ships, Cale watched the explosion with tears in his eyes. The rebellion had succeeded, but the cost had been high. "He did it," Cale said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. "He gave us freedom." The prisoners aboard the ships were silent, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of Ethan's sacrifice. But as the transport ships soared into the stars, leaving the prison planet behind, a spark of hope burned brightly in their hearts. Ethan's legacy would live on, not just as the man who saved a friend, but as the hero who freed thousands and ignited a rebellion that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come.